Welcome to How to Cook That. I'm Ann Reardon, and this week we are looking at one of the biggest deceptions in marketing history. I don't think you would get away with this today, and yet somehow they did and kind of still do. I'm sure if you've been to the store you would have seen some Betty Crocker frosting or baking mixes, or maybe you've even bought one of the 75 million copies of cookbooks that they've sold over the years. She's been described as an icon and one of the most recognisable American women of all time. And if you Google Betty Crocker, one of the top searches is Betty Crocker still alive? The answer to that question is no. Not because she died. She simply never lived. You see, Betty Crocker is not a real person. She was made up. So how did the flour company that invented her fool the world into thinking that she was real? Well, it all started back in 1921 when the Washburn Crosby Company placed this ad in the newspaper for their gold medal flour. The ad was a puzzle, and if you completed the puzzle, which wasn't that easy, and then sent it in, they would mail you this cute little flour sack pincushion to keep all your sewing pins handy. Thousands of people completed that puzzle and sent it in. But what they weren't expecting was hundreds of them also wrote a letter asking questions about baking bread and cake and biscuits. Now, the Vice President thought that it would be more credible if the answers to those questions were signed by a woman rather than a man. So they invented a name, Crocker, after the Vice President, and Betty because it sounded cozy. The ladies at the company each made up a Betty Crocker signature, and the best looking one was chosen. The other girls in the office were taught how to forge the new Betty Crocker signature, and that is the same one that is still used today. As well as replying to letters, Betty also started appearing in newspaper columns and magazine articles recommending recipes. Within a few years, Betty was so popular that they had to employ 21 home economists to test and invent new recipes and to reply to letters, and they even started travelling the country and doing cooking demonstrations. At this time, radios were becoming more affordable, so many housewives had access to one. So in 1924, the Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air started broadcasting from Minneapolis. It was the very first radio cooking show.
So here she is, your Betty Crocker.
Well, today I'm going to give you a menu for the sort of homey meal every bride ought to know how to prepare for her husband. Of course, when you think of preparing a meal that will go to a man's heart, you think of steak. For all men seem to love steak.
The whole show was actually an advert paid for by the flour company. I know it doesn't sound like an advert, but that's because back then there were no laws that said that broadcasters had to clearly differentiate between ads and editorial content. So it ran more like a show. It was on at 10 a.m. every day, and Betty would do an interview, or she would read a letter from one of her people who've written into her and share a story, and then she would go through a recipe, and somewhere in there she would promote gold medal flour. A couple of years later, and NBC started broadcasting, so Betty's show, or should I say advert, started going national. Now, from the letters that were coming in to Betty, the flour company found out that women at home were feeling insecure and anxious and underappreciated. So the show really focused on being positive and encouraging and uplifting and praising women for the work that they were doing at home. They even interviewed husbands who were admiring towards their wives and saying positive things, and the show was a hit. In 1928, the company was bought out by General Mills, and they also, with that, got the ownership of Betty. Now, up until this point, some of the pictures of Betty in adverts had some confusing differences. They weren't exactly the same, so they hired an artist to paint a portrait of Betty that they could use in all future advertising. She wore a white shirt, a bright red jacket, red lipstick, and perfectly styled hair. They also drew up a Betty Crocker policy for the copywriters, which stated anything that Betty Crocker said must be dignified, friendly, but not intimate. She's to stick to home economics and not discuss her private life, and Betty should say we, not I because it would be unsound to represent Betty as a superwoman who thinks up all her own recipes. I had to laugh at that because it's unsound to represent her as someone who could come up with all her own recipes, but it's okay to pretend she's real when she doesn't exist. Even the people who were doing tours of the factory at the time, when people asked if they could see Betty Crocker, they were told to say, "She's not in today," which is technically true. She was never in, and if someone asked for a photo of Betty, they were to say Betty didn't like having her photo taken. In 1939, the horrors of World War II began. There were food shortages and many countries around the world introduced rationing in order to try and stretch the limited food supply to everyone so nobody missed out. My mum still has a ration book from World War II. Her parents would hand in these coupons to get a limited amount of meat, eggs, fats, cheese, bacon and sugar to last for a whole week. The other items were rationed using a points system. The War Office in the US asked General Mills to donate Betty's time and NBC to donate airtime to make a show that would encourage women on how they could use their limited food supply to make recipes and meals for their family. Along with the show, there was also 7 million copies of the Betty Crocker wartime ration recipe booklet that was distributed to people. By the start of 1945, Betty Crocker was described as one of the most famous women in the US, second only to the First Lady. She was receiving 4,000 letters a day and had got 10 marriage proposals amongst them. The letters being sent in were no longer just about baking bread and biscuits and cakes. People thought that Betty was a real person, and they were writing in to confide in her, to ask her questions and to tell her about their problems. One real letter read, "Oh, Betty Crocker, I suppose I shouldn't be pouring my heart out to you, but one always feels better getting their troubles off their chests, and some things just can't be told even to one's best friend." Then in April of 1945, 24 years after Betty was created, Fortune magazine ran an article which exposed the fact that Betty was not real. It said Betty was just a creation of General Mills. It said that she had no body, that she was purely imaginary, and that General Mills had spent $10 million synthesizing Betty Crocker with radio programs and advertisements. $10 million back in 1945 is equivalent to $167 million today. So that's a pretty decent advertising budget that they have put into Betty Crocker. Now, that magazine was only read by 1% of the population at the time, and if that was now, obviously it just would have spread all over the internet in a day, and I imagine Betty Crocker would have been cancelled. But back then news spread a lot more slowly, so General Mills was able to control the release of the information themselves, and they started running ads that said, "Meet the real Betty Crocker," all 21 of her. And they had photos and qualifications of all the women who worked in the home ec department at General Mills. And we also have to remember that this article came out when the war was still going. So for a lot of people that would put this into a different perspective. Like, who cares if Betty Crocker's made up? I want to know if my loved ones are going to come home safely from the war or not. They had bigger things to worry about. The timing could also explain some people's reaction to the news, which was, well, at least if she's not real, she can't die. She'll always be around for us. So people either seem to accept it or they didn't actually know about it. Certainly the radio show continued and the print ads continued, and adverts like this one on TV with Betty dressed in red seemed to be trying to keep up the illusion.
The time was ripe for further experimentation. Betty Crocker and her staff had already given years of service to homemakers. From these months and months of testing, a new home method was developed. As a final check, the recipes for this new Betty Crocker method were sent to hundreds of homemakers from coast to coast.
Employees at the test kitchen said that when they did tours, people were often heartbroken to find out that Betty Crocker wasn't there, and they stared in disbelief when they were told that she was not a real person. They said they had to have lots of boxes of tissues on hand for all the tears. So obviously the news didn't get to everyone. In 1950, the Betty Crocker picture cookbook was released with record-breaking sales of nearly 1 million copies, which shows just how well the long-running radio show, or should I say advert, worked at building the persona of Betty Crocker. I don't imagine that a cookbook with General Mills on the cover would have sold quite so well, but that's exactly what it is. It's a General Mills cookbook, cleverly marketed. A survey done by General Mills at the time said that 99% of American housewives recognised the name Betty Crocker. Because of its successful marketing strategy, several other companies jumped onto the bandwagon and made up their own pretend person to be in their home economics department, like Mary Blake for Carnation or Patricia Collier for Dole. But they didn't have 20 years of advertising budget behind them, so they quickly faded. Now, by this time, television was gaining traction, and most of the people who'd had a successful radio show now had a TV show. So General Mills hired an actress, Adelaide Hawley Cumming, who actually didn't like cooking, to be Betty Crocker on the Betty Crocker television show.
Hello, everybody.
Adelaide's real name was of course not mentioned in the show, but it didn't even appear on the credits. And strangely, she never cooked in the show. They just had her sitting behind a desk with the Betty Crocker label, and then when it was time to demonstrate a recipe, they went over to one of the other home economists, Ruth, who would demonstrate how to cook it. The show flopped, and then they tried another variation of a show which also flopped. So they gave up on the TV show and just had Adelaide doing ads instead. The first Betty Crocker cake mixes had been launched a little while ago, but they were not selling very well. After years of Betty talking up baking a cake as an accomplishment, an achievement, and something to be proud of, now trying to advertise, here's a cake mix, you just chuck in the water and it's easy, you get a perfect cake, anyone can do it. It kind of takes out that sense of pride and achievement in what you've done. So they met with some psychologists and they recommended letting the women add their own eggs so they felt like they were still part of the process of making it. So General Mills and other companies did exactly that. They took out the powdered eggs and let you add your own.
And 2 of your own fresh eggs. Those fresh eggs keep it moist and tender to the last crumb.
And it worked. People started buying cake mixes, and lots of them. I actually think nowadays some people would appreciate being able to just add water, so maybe they could do an update there. By 1960, Betty Crocker had disappeared from the TV and from radio altogether, but you could still see her in print ads and her signature on the logo of things. Her portrait has been updated many times over the years, always with the iconic red jacket, brown hair and blue eyes, until the most recent brown-eyed Betty. And amazingly, more than 100 years on, and many people still assume that Betty Crocker was a real person. And Google, is she still alive? With thanks to my patrons for your amazing support that allows me to do the research for all these sorts of videos. If you'd like to become a patron, head over there, click on the link and check out what the different rewards are. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, comment, share, watch more of my videos, do all of the things that tell the algorithm they should recommend this video to someone else. Make it a great week by being kind to others, and I'll see you on Friday.